Thomas Paine took up his pen in response to a sermon by the Bishop of Llandaff titled "The Wisdom and Goodness of God in Having Made Both Rich and Poor." Poverty, Paine argued, existed because of entrenched privilege. Upon completion, this essay by Paine was delivered to the legislature and the executive directory of the French Republic. Paine explains the reasons for undertaking this analysis. The plan contained in this work is not adapted for any particular country alone. The principle on which it is based is general, but as the rights of man are a new study in this world, and one needing protection from priestly imposture and the insolence of oppressions too long established, I have thought it right to place this little work under your safeguard. Paine at this point, near the end of 1795, still had faith that a democracy would be established out of the French Revolution. After 11 months held in Luxembourg prison in Paris, Paine had returned to the National Convention in 1794. When we reflect on the long and dense night in which France and all Europe have remained plunged by their governments and their priests, we must feel less surprise than grief at the bewilderment caused by the first burst of light that dispels the darkness. The eye accustomed to darkness can hardly bear at first the broad daylight. It is by usage the eye learns to see, and it is the same in passing from any situation to its opposite. As we have not at one instant renounced all our errors, we cannot at one stroke acquire knowledge of all our rights. Francis had the honor of adding to the word liberty that of equality, and this word signifies essentially a principle that admits of no gradation in the things to which it applies. But equality is often misunderstood, often misapplied, and often violated. With this essay, Paine will make the case for a particular type of equality. Liberty and property are words expressing all those of our possessions which are not of an intellectual nature. There are two kinds of property. Firstly, natural property, or that which comes to us from the Creator of the universe, such as the earth, air, water. Secondly, artificial or acquired property, the invention of men. What should we make of Paine's reference to, quote, possessions of an intellectual nature, unquote? In the latter, equality is impossible, for to distribute it equally it would be necessary that all should have contributed in the same proportion, which can never be the case. And this being the case, every individual would hold on to his own property as his right share. Equality of natural property is the subject of this little essay. Every individual in the world is born therein with legitimate claims on a certain kind of property or its equivalent. The right of voting for persons charged with the execution of the laws that govern society is inherent in the word liberty and constitutes the equality of personal rights. But even if that right of voting were inherent in property, which I deny, the right of suffrage would still belong to all equally because, as I have said, all individuals have legitimate birthrights in a certain species of property. It is interesting to ponder what Paine would think of the U.S. Supreme Court's decision that corporations are persons. I have always considered the present Constitution of the French Republic the best organized system the human mind has yet produced. But I hope my former colleagues will not be offended if I warn them of an error which has slipped into its principle. Equality of the right of suffrage is not maintained. This right is, in it, connected with a condition on which it ought not to depend, that is, with a proportion of a certain tax called direct. Note Paine's slight of the U.S. Constitution here. By Paine's standard of just law, the U.S. fell far short because of its preservation of slavery, limits on the franchise, and other accommodations to privilege. The dignity of suffrage is thus lowered, and in placing it in the scale with an inferior thing, the enthusiasm that right is capable of inspiring is diminished. It is impossible to find any equivalent counterpoise for the right of suffrage, because it is alone worthy to be its own basis, and cannot thrive as a graft or an appendage. The air contained in this sermon determined me to publish my Agrarian Justice. It is wrong to say God made rich and poor. He made only male and female, and he gave them the earth for their inheritance. And what Paine used his pen to condemn was the loss of this inheritance under laws that allowed for the redistribution of wealth from producers to a non-producing rentier elite. Instead of preaching to encourage one part of mankind in insolence, it would be better that priests employ their time to render the general condition of man less miserable than it is. Practical religion consists in doing good, and the only way of serving God is that of endeavoring to make his creation happy. All preaching that has not this for its object is nonsense and hypocrisy. Paine would certainly have stood beside Father Edward McGlynn and Henry George in their anti-poverty crusade in New York. He would have also championed the liberation theology movement of recent times. To preserve the benefits of what is called civilized life, and to remedy at the same time the evil which it has produced, ought to be considered as one of the first objects of reformed legislation. Whether that state that is proudly, most erroneously called civilization has most promoted or most injured the general happiness of man is a question that may be strongly contested. On one side, the spectator is dazzled by splendid appearances. On the other, he is shocked by extremes of wretchedness, both of which it has erected. The most affluent and the most miserable of the human race are to be found in the countries that are called civilized. Then and today, poverty is a common denominator in all societies. The differences are differences in degree only. To understand what the state of society ought to be, it is necessary to have some idea of the natural and primitive state of man, such as it is at this day among the Indians of North America. There is not in that state any of those spectacles of human misery which poverty and want present to our eyes in all the towns and streets in Europe. Tribal societies in North America at the time were only mildly hierarchical. Generally, what was produced was shared equally by all. Poverty, therefore, is a thing created by that which is called civilized life. It exists not in the natural state. On the other hand, the natural state is without those advantages which flow from agriculture, arts, science, and manufactures. The life of an Indian is a continual holiday compared with the poor of Europe, and on the other hand, it appears to be abject when compared to the rich. Civilization, therefore, or that which is so called, has operated two ways, to make one part of society more affluent and the other more wretched than would have been the lot of either in a natural state. It is always possible to go from the natural to the civilized state, but it is never possible to go from the civilized to the natural state. The reason is that man in a natural state, subsisting by hunting, requires 10 times the quantity of land to range over to procure himself sustenance than would support him in a civilized state where the earth is cultivated. Is Paine on firm ground here? What about the countless efforts by people to establish self-governing, self-sustaining, utopian communities? When, therefore, a country becomes populous by the additional aids of cultivation, art, and science, there is a necessity of preserving things in that state, because without it there cannot be sustenance for more, perhaps, than a tenth part of its inhabitants. The thing, therefore, now to be done is to remedy the evils and preserve the benefits that have arisen to society by passing from the natural to that which is called the civilized state. In taking the matter upon this ground, the first principle of civilization ought to have been, and ought still to be, that the condition of every person born into the world after a state of civilization commences ought not to be worse than if he had been born before that period. But the fact is that the condition of millions in every country in Europe is far worse than if they had been born before civilization began, had been born among the Indians of North America at the present. I will show how this fact has happened. It is a position not to be controverted that the earth in its natural cultivated state was and ever would have continued to be the common property of the human race. In that state, every man would have been born to property. He would have been a joint life proprietor, with rest in the property of the soil, and all its natural productions, vegetable and animal. But the earth in its natural state, as before said, is capable of supporting but a small number of inhabitants compared with what it is capable of doing in a cultivated state. And as it is impossible to separate the improvement made by cultivation from the earth itself, upon which that improvement is made, the idea of landed property arose from that parable connection. But it is nevertheless true that it is the value of the improvement only, and not the earth itself, that is individual property. At the same time Paine was writing, there was an active market for property. Not everyone constructed their own dwellings. Costs were known. Every proprietor, therefore, of cultivated lands owes to the community a ground rent, for I know of no better term to express the idea, for the land which he holds, and it is from this ground rent that the fund proposed in this plan is to issue. Where agricultural land is concerned, the ground rent payment could be determined by comparing grades of land with one another. The rent payment would be the difference between what was harvested on the best quality land and the least quality land that could be cultivated. Paine did not extend his analysis to urban sites. It is deducible as well from the nature of the thing as from all the stories transmitted to us that the idea of landed property commenced with cultivation, and that there was no such thing as landed property before that time. It could not exist in the first state of man, and that of hunters. It did not exist in the second state, that of shepherds. Neither Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, nor Job, so far as the history of the Bible may be credited in probable things, were owners of land. Their property consisted, as is always enumerated, in flocks and herds. They traveled with them from place to place. The frequent contentions at that time about the use of a well in the dry country of Arabia, where those people lived, also show that there was no landed property. It was not admitted that land could be claimed as property. There could be no such thing as landed property originally. Man did not make the earth, and though he had a natural right to occupy it, he had no right to locate as his property in perpetuity any part of it. Neither did the Creator of the earth open a land office from whence the first title deeds should issue. Still, there had to be generally accepted rules for accessing land so that all had an equal opportunity. Whence then arose the idea of landed property? I answer as before, that when cultivation began, the idea of landed property began with it, from the impossibility of separating the improvement made by cultivation from the earth itself, upon which that improvement was made. The value of the improvement so far exceeded the value of the natural earth at that time as to absorb it, till in the end the common right of all became confounded into the cultivated right of the individual. But there are, nevertheless, distinct species of rights, and will continue to be so long as the earth endures. By improvement, I think Paine is referring to the clearing of land, the adding of nutrients, draining of wetlands, irrigating as necessary, etc. It is only by tracing things to their origin that we can gain rightful ideas of them, and it is by gaining such ideas that we discover the boundary that divides right from wrong and teaches every man to know his own. I have entitled this tract Agrarian Justice to distinguish it from agrarian law. Nothing could be more unjust than agrarian law in a country improved by cultivation. For though every man, as an inhabitant of the earth, is a joint proprietor of it in its natural state, it does not follow that he is a joint proprietor of cultivated earth. The additional value made by cultivation, after the system was admitted, became the property of those who did it, or who inherited it from them, or who purchased it. It had originally no owner. While therefore I advocate the right and interest myself in the hard case of all those who have been thrown out of their natural inheritance by the introduction of the system of landed property, I equally defend the right of the possessor to the part which is his. Cultivation is at least one of the greatest natural improvements ever made by human invention. It has given to created earth a tenfold value. But the landed monopoly that began with it has produced the greatest evil. It has dispossessed more than half the inhabitants of every nation of their natural inheritance, without providing for them, as ought to have been done, an indemnification for that loss, and has thereby created a species of poverty and wretchedness that did not exist before. Landed monopolies were achieved by civil wars and by aristocracies with the power to take land and dispossess peasants. In advocating the case of the persons thus dispossessed, it is a right and not a charity that I am pleading for, but it is that kind of right which, being neglected at first, could not be brought forward afterwards till heaven had opened the way by a revolution in the system of government. Let us then do honor to revolutions by justice, and give currency to their principles by blessings. Having thus in a few words opened the merits of the case, I shall now proceed to the plan I have to propose, which is to create a national fund, out of which there shall be paid to every person, when arrived at the age of 21 years, the sum of £15 sterling as a compensation in part for the loss of his or her natural inheritance by the introduction of the system of landed property. And also the sum of £10 per annum during life to every person now living of the age of 50 years, and to all others as they shall arrive at that age. Of course, it is significant to acknowledge what percentage of the population actually lived to age 50. At the dawn of the system of Social Security in the United States, setting the age of eligibility at 65 guaranteed that the number of people receiving benefits would be relatively small in relation to contributions made to the fund. I have already established the principle, namely that the earth in its natural uncultivated state was, and ever would have continued to be, the common property of the human race, that in that state every person would have been born to property, and that the system of landed property, by its inseparable connection with cultivation and with what is called civilized life, has absorbed the property of all those whom it dispossessed, without providing, as ought to have been done, an indemnification. One meaning of the word indemnification is to compensate one for damage experienced. The fault, however, is not in the present possessors. No complaint is intended or ought to be alleged against them unless they adopt the crime of opposing justice. The fault is in the system, and it has stolen perceptibly upon the world, aided afterwards by the agrarian law of the sword. But the fault can be made to reform itself by successive generations, and without diminishing or deranging the property of any of present possessors. The operation of the fund can yet commence, and in full activity, the first year of its establishment, or soon after, as I shall show. It is proposed that the payments, as already stated, be made to every person, rich or poor. It is best to make it so, to prevent invidious distinctions. It is also right it should be so, because it is in lieu of the natural inheritance, which as a right belongs to every man, over and above property he may have created or inherited from those who did. Such persons as do not choose to receive it can throw it into the common fund. Taking it then for granted that no person ought to be in a worse condition when born, under what is called a state of civilization, than he would have been had he been born in a state of nature, and that civilization ought to have made, and ought still to make, provision for that purpose, it can only be done by subtracting from property a portion equal in value to the natural inheritance it has absorbed. What should we conclude that he meant by this? An estate tax, perhaps? Various methods may be proposed for this purpose, but that which appears to be the best, not only because it will operate without deranging any present possessors, or without interfering with the collection of taxes or emprunts necessary for the purposes of government and the revolution, but because it will be the least troublesome and the most effectual, and also because the subtraction will be made at a time that best admits it, is at the moment that property is passing by the death of one person to the possession of another. An empreinte is a debt resulting from a loan. In this case, the bequeather gives nothing, the receiver pays nothing. The only matter to him is that the monopoly of natural inheritance, to which there never was a right, begins to cease in his person. A generous man would not wish it to continue, and a just man will rejoice to see it abolished. My state of health prevents my making sufficient inquiries with respect to the doctrine of probabilities, whereon to found calculations with such degrees of certainty as they are capable of. What therefore I offer on this head is more the result of observation and reflection than of received information, but I believe it will be found to agree sufficiently with fact. In the first place, taking 21 years as the epoch of maturity, all the property of a nation, real and personal, is always in the possession of persons above that age. It is then necessary to know, as a datum of calculation, the average of years which persons above that age will live. I take this average to be about 30 years, for though many persons will live 40, 50, or 60 years after the age of 21 years, others will die much sooner, and some in every year of that time. Taking then 30 years as the average of time, it will give, without any material variation one way or other, the average of time in which the whole property or capital of a nation, or a sum equal thereto, will have passed through one entire revolution in descent, that is, will have gone by deaths to new possessors. For though in many instances some parts of this capital will remain 40, 50, or 60 years in the possession of one person, other parts will have revolved 2 or 3 times before those 30 years expire, which will bring it to that average. For were one half the capital of a nation to revolve twice in 30 years, it would produce the same fund as if the whole revolved once. Taking then 30 years as the average of time in which the whole capital of a nation, or a sum equal thereto, will revolve once, the 30th part thereof will be the sum that will revolve every year, that is, will go by deaths to new possessors, and this last sum being thus known, and the ratio per cent to be subtracted from it determined, it will give the annual amount or income of the proposed fund to be applied, as already mentioned. It will always happen that of the property thus revolving by deaths every year, a part will descend in a direct line to sons and daughters, and other part collaterally, and the proportion will be found to be about 3 to 1. That is, about 30 millions of the above sum will descend to direct heirs, and the remaining sum to more distant relations, and in part to strangers. Considering then that man is always related to society, that relationship will become comparatively greater in proportion as the next of kin is more distant. It is therefore consistent with civilization to say that where there are no direct heirs, society shall be heir to a part over and above the 10th part due to society. Having thus arrived at the annual amount of the proposed fund, I come, in the next place, to speak of the population proportion to this fund and to compare it with the uses to which the fund is to be applied. The population, I mean that of England, does not exceed 7 millions and a half, and the number of persons above the age of 50 will in that case be about 400,000. There would not, however, be more than that number that would accept the proposed £10 per annum, though they would be entitled to it. Is Paine's optimism warranted? Will most of those who are relatively well off opt not to accept their rightful share of the rent fund, or what might be called a citizen's dividend? I have no idea it would be accepted by many persons who had a yearly income of £200 or £300, but as we often see instances of rich people falling into sudden poverty, even at the age of 60, they would always have the right of drawing all the arrears due to them. I come now to speak of the persons annually arriving at 21 years of age. If all the persons who died were above the age of 21 years, the number of persons annually arriving at that age must be equal to the annual number of deaths to keep the population stationary. But the greater part die under the age of 21, and therefore the number of persons annually arriving at 21 will be less than half the number of deaths. There are in every country a number of blind and lame persons totally incapable of earning a livelihood, but as it will always happen that the greater number of blind persons will be among those who are above the age of 50 years, they will be provided for in that class. Having now gone through all the necessary calculations and stated the particulars of the plan, I shall conclude with some observations. It is not charity, but a right, not bounty, but justice that I am pleading for. The present state of civilization is as odious as it is unjust. It is absolutely the opposite of what it should be, and it is necessary that a revolution should be made in it. The contrast of affluence and wretchedness continually meeting and offending the eye is like dead and living bodies chained together. Though I care as little about riches as any man, I am a friend to riches because they are capable of good. Paine's view is that wherever widespread poverty exists, the cause is systemic and societal, not that of individual failings. I care not how affluent some may be, provided that none be miserable in consequence of it, but it is impossible to enjoy affluence with the felicity it is capable of being enjoyed, while so much misery is mingled in the scene. The sight of the misery and the unpleasant sensations it suggests, which, though they may be suffocated, cannot be extinguished, are a greater drawback upon the felicity of affluence than the proposed 10% upon property is worth. He that would not give the one to get rid of the other has no charity, even for himself. There are in every country some magnificent charities established by individuals. It is, however, but little that any individual can do when the whole extent of the misery to be relieved is considered. He may satisfy his conscience, but not his heart. He may give all that he has, and that all will relieve but little. It is only by organizing civilization upon such principles as to act like a system of pulleys that the whole weight of misery can be removed. The plan here proposed will reach the whole. It will immediately relieve and take out of view three classes of wretchedness: the blind, the lame, and the aged poor, and it will furnish the rising generation with means to prevent their becoming poor, and it will do this without deranging or interfering with any national measures. To show that this will be the case, it is sufficient to observe that the operation and effect of the plan will, in all cases, be the same as if every individual were voluntarily to make his will and dispose of his property in the manner here proposed. But it is justice and not charity that is the principle of the plan. In all great cases, it is necessary to have a principle more universally active than charity. And with respect to justice, it ought not to be left to the choice of detached individuals whether they will do justice or not. Considering, then, the plan on the ground of justice, it ought to be the act of the whole growing spontaneously out of the principles of the Revolution, and the reputation of it ought to be national and not individual. A plan upon this principle would benefit the Revolution by the energy that springs from the consciousness of justice. It would multiply also the national resources, for property, like vegetation, increases by offsets. When a young couple begin the world, the difference is exceedingly great whether they begin with nothing or with 15 pounds apiece. With this aid, they could buy a cow and implements to cultivate a few acres of land, and instead of becoming burdens upon society, which is always the case where children are produced faster than they can be fed, would be put in the way of becoming useful and profitable citizens. The national domains also would sell the better if pecuniary aids were provided to cultivate them in small lots. It is the practice of what has unjustly obtained the name of civilization, and the practice merits not to be called either charity or policy, to make some provision for persons becoming poor and wretched only at the time they become so. Would it not, even as a matter of economy, be far better to adopt means to prevent them becoming poor? This can best be done by making every person, when arrived at the age of 21 years, an inheritor of something to begin with. The rugged face of society, checkered with the extremes of affluence and want, proves that some extraordinary violence has been committed upon it, and calls on justice for redress. The great mass of the poor in countries are become an hereditary race, and it is next to impossible for them to get out of that state of themselves. It ought also to be observed that this mass increases in all countries that are called civilized. More persons fall annually into it than get out of it. Though in a plan of which justice and humanity are the foundation principles, interest ought not to be admitted into the calculation, yet it is always of advantage to the establishment of any plan to show that it is beneficial as a matter of interest. The success of any proposed plan submitted to public consideration must finally depend on the numbers interested in supporting it, united with the justice of its principles. The plan here proposed will benefit all, without injuring any. It will consolidate the interest of the republic with that of the individual. To the numerous class dispossessed of their natural inheritance by the system of landed property, it will be an act of national justice. To persons dying possessed of moderate fortunes, it will operate as a tontine to their children, more beneficial than the sum of money paid into the fund. And it will give to the accumulation of riches a degree of security that none of old governments of Europe, now tottering on their foundations, can give. A tontine is an insurance plan where the participants allow the annuities to accumulate as each participant dies, the final survivor receiving the whole. I do not suppose that more than one family in 10 in any of the countries of Europe has, when the head of the family dies, a clear property of £500 sterling. To all such, the plan is advantageous. That property would pay £50 into the fund, and if there were only 2 children under age, they would receive £15 each, £30, on coming of age, and be entitled to £10 a year after 50. It is from the overgrown acquisition of property that the fund will support itself, and I know that the possessors of such property in England, though they would eventually be benefited by the protection of 9/10 of it, will exclaim against the plan. But without entering any inquiry how they came by that property, let them recollect that they have been the advocates of this war, and that Mr. Pitt has already laid on more new taxes to be raised annually upon the people of England than would pay annually all the sums proposed in this plan. Paine is referring to Britain's war with France. The Bourbons ruled France until the execution of Louis XVI in 1793. I have made the calculations stated in this plan upon what is called personal as well as upon landed property. The reason for making it upon land is already explained, and the reason for taking personal property into the calculation is equally well founded, though on a different principle. Land, as before said, is the free gift of the Creator in common to the human race. Personal property is the effect of society, and it is as impossible for an individual to acquire personal property without the aid of society as it is for him to make land originally. This observation by Paine challenges the idea of the self-made individual. Separate an individual from society and give him an island or a continent to possess, and he cannot acquire personal property. He cannot be rich. So inseparably are the means connected with the end, in all cases, that where the former do not exist, the latter cannot be attained. All accumulation, therefore, of personal property, beyond what a man's own hands produce, is derived to him by living in society, and he owes on every principle of justice, of gratitude, and of civilization a part of that accumulation back again to society from whence the whole came. As Henry George would later elaborate, the claim by society is equal to the rent of land. This is putting the matter on a general principle, and perhaps it is best to do so. For if we examine the case minutely, it will be found that the accumulation of personal property is, in many instances, the effect of paying too little for the labor that produced it, the consequence of which is that the working hand perishes in old age and the employer abounds in affluence. It is perhaps impossible to proportion exactly the price of labor to the profits it produces, and it will also be said, as an apology for the injustice, that were a workman to receive an increase of wages daily, he would not save it against old age, nor be much better for it in the interim. Make then society the treasurer to guard it for him in a common fund, for it is no reason that, because he might not make a good use of it for himself, another should take it. Libertarians would argue against this level of social engineering for competent adults. A real challenge for societal agents is establishing criteria to determine incompetency. The state of civilization that has prevailed throughout Europe is as unjust in its principle as it is horrid in its effects, and it is the consciousness of this and the apprehension that such a state cannot continue when once investigation begins in any country that makes the possessors of property dread every idea of a revolution. It is the hazard and not the principle of revolutions that retards their progress. This being the case, it is necessary as well for the protection of property as for the sake of justice and humanity to form a system that, while it preserves one part of society from wretchedness, shall secure the other from depreciation. The superstitious awe, the enslaving reverence that formerly surrounded affluence, is passing away in all countries and leaving the possessor of property to the convulsion of accidents. When wealth and splendor, instead of fascinating the multitude, excite emotions of disgust, when instead of drawing forth admiration, it is beheld as an insult on wretchedness, when the ostentatious appearance it makes calls the right of it in question, the case of property becomes critical, and it is only in a system of justice that the possessor can contemplate security. To remove the danger, it is necessary to remove the antipathies, and this can only be done by making property productive of a national bless, extending to every individual. When the riches of one man above other shall increase the national fund in the same proportion, when it shall be seen that the prosperity of that fund depends on the prosperity of individuals, when the more riches a man acquires, the better it shall be for the general mass, it is then that antipathies will cease and property be placed on the permanent basis of national interest and protection. I have no property in France to become subject to the plan I propose. What I have, which is not much, is in the United States of America. But I will pay £100 sterling toward this fund in France the instant it shall be established, and I will pay the same sum in England whenever a similar establishment shall take place in that country. A revolution in the state of civilization is a necessary companion of revolutions in the system of government. If a revolution in any country be from bad to good, or from good to bad, the state of what is called civilization in that country must be made conformable thereto, to give that revolution effect. Despotic government supports itself by abject civilization, in which debasement of the human mind and wretchedness in the mass of the people are the chief criterions. Such governments consider man merely as an animal, that the exercise of intellectual faculty is not his privilege, that he has nothing to do with the laws but to obey them, and they politically depend more upon breaking the spirit of the people by poverty than they fear engaging it by desperation. It is a revolution in the state of civilization that will give perfection to Revolution of France. Already, the conviction that government by representation is the true system of government is spreading itself fast in the world. The reasonableness of it can be seen by all. The justness of it makes itself felt even by its opposers. But when a system of civilization, growing out of that system of government, shall be so organized that not a man or woman born in the Republic but shall inherit some means of beginning the world, and see before them the certainty of escaping the miseries that under other governments accompany old age, the Revolution of France will have an advocate and an ally in the heart of all nations. An army of principles will penetrate where an army of soldiers cannot. It will succeed where diplomatic management would fail. It is neither the Rhine, the Channel, nor the ocean that can arrest its progress. It will march on the horizon of the world, and it will conquer. One. Each canton shall elect in its primary assemblies 3 persons as commissioners for that canton, who shall take cognizance and keep a register of all matters happening in that canton, conformable to the charter that shall be established by law for carrying this plan into execution. 2. The law shall fix the manner in which the property of deceased persons shall be ascertained. 3. When the amount of the property of any deceased persons shall be ascertained, the principal heir to that property, or the eldest of the co-heirs, if of lawful age, or if under age, the person authorized by the will of the deceased to represent him or them, shall give bond to the commissioners of the canton to pay the said 10th part thereof in 4 equal quarterly payments, within the space of 1 year or sooner, at the choice of the payers. 1/2 of the whole property shall remain as a security until the bond be paid off. 4. The bond shall be registered in the office of the commissioners of the canton, and the original bond shall be deposited in the National Bank at Paris. The bank shall publish every quarter of a year the amount of the bonds in its possession, and also the bonds that shall have been paid off, or what parts thereof, since the last quarterly publication. The National Bank shall issue banknotes upon the security of the bonds in its possession. The notes so issued shall be applied to pay the pensions of aged persons and the compensations to persons arriving at 21 years of age. It is both reasonable and generous to suppose that persons not under immediate necessity will suspend their right of drawing on the fund until it acquire, as it will do, a greater degree of ability. In this case, it is proposed that an honorary register be kept in each canton of the names of the persons thus suspending that right, at least during the present war. 6. As the inheritors of property must always take up their bonds in 4 quarterly payments, or sooner if they choose, there will always be numeraire arriving at the bank after the expiration of the first quarter to exchange for the banknotes that shall be brought in. A numeraire is a tradable economic entity such as gold, serving as a unit of account to measure relative prices of goods and services. 7. The banknotes being thus put in circulation upon the best of all possible security, that of actual property, to more than 4 times the amount of the bonds upon which the notes are issued, and with numeraire continually arriving at the bank to exchange or pay them off whenever they shall be presented for that purpose, they will acquire a permanent value in all parts of the Republic. They can therefore be received in payment of taxes, or emprunts equal to numeraire, because the government can always receive numeraire for them at the bank. 8. It will be necessary that the payments of the 10% be made in numeraire for the first year from the establishment of the plan, but after the expiration of the first year, the inheritors of property may pay 10% either in banknotes issued upon the fund or in numeraire. If the payments be in numeraire, it will lie as a deposit at the bank, be exchanged for a quantity of notes equal to that amount, and if in notes issued upon the fund, it will cause a demand upon the fund equal thereto, and thus the operation of the plan will create means to carry itself into execution. And so ends this most remarkable expression of the principles I described by the term cooperative individualism. Paine was truly the architect of a societal framework that, if embraced, would have secured a high degree of equality of opportunity for future generations. That his profound insight into the human condition and the specific character of just governance were ignored proved to be a tragedy of great dimension for the generations that followed.